If you're looking to level up your career, or if you're aiming for roles like AWS Developer, Cloud Architect, DevOps Engineer, or Full Stack Developer, or even you have been attending interviews for these roles, by now you'll know how crucial it is to have a strong hands-on project on your resume. And today we are diving into building a cloud-based dynamic blood bank management system right on the AWS Cloud. But before we get into it, if you're struggling to land a high-paying job in any of these roles, I would love to invite you to a free AWS Cloud Masterclass. In this session, we will share a proven 3-step strategy that's helped learners like Tolu, Kennedy, Renga, and many others land their dream cloud jobs. So make sure that you don't miss out. Check the description and pin comments for the registration link. In today's session, we will be setting up an EC2 instance to host a dynamic web server, connecting it to an RDS database, and securing all of it with IAM roles and S3 bucket for file storage. We will also walk you through how to interact with your database using tools like MySQL Workbench to execute operations, no coding experience required. And this project not only builds your cloud infrastructure skills, but also empowers you to extend your AWS knowledge to applications that require dynamic data handling. So let's get started.
Okay, hello everyone. Very good morning, good evening, based on wherever you're joining in. And welcome to this project-based session that we're going to do in here on the AWS Cloud. My apologies, there is some issue with my camera, so I'll probably not be able to start it, but I'm here on audio and I'll be actually walking you through this project work session in here. Can I just get a quick confirmation that I'm loud and clear and my screen is also visible?
Yes, absolutely. You're clear and straight, audible.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. It is a hands-on session. So if you can do the hands-on along with me, that is fine. If not, you can observe how I'm doing it, and then you can later on do it on your own as well. So I can give you a quick walkthrough of the setup in here, of the things in here. So this is going to be a cloud-based dynamic blood bank management system that we are going to create in here. And we are going to set that up with the AWS Cloud environment in here. So let me quickly show you what kind of an architecture we might have for the complete application. Although for now, what we'll be doing is we'll only implement a subset of it to get started with. So let me do one thing. Instead of the diagram, let me quickly show you what we will be doing in here. So we will be setting up a cloud-based dynamic blood bank management system. So for this, we will be creating an EC2 instance for the web server database server. Then we'll be configuring RDS database and connecting to the EC2 and set up a web server on the VM in here. So see, essentially what we are trying to do in here is, instead of just creating an EC2, we are actually going to create a VM or EC2 with an application on top of it, which is able to connect to a database. And then later on, what you can do is you can try to expand on this by seeing whether you can apply auto scaling to it or how you can add notification to it. So that will be like a stretch activity for you people based on this in here. Okay, so essentially, the goal that we have in here is we want to build something like a blood bank management system in here. So we want to create a blood bank management system. Okay. So that is what we essentially want to go ahead and want to build in here. Now, for doing this, though, what will be the components that we will have? Obviously, to run an application, you need some kind of application files for that. So basically, we already have those basic web files that you can have, or whatever PHP files are there, which are sitting on a Git repository in here. So you don't need to worry about it. There are files from the Git repository, which we will be uploading to the S3 bucket in. So we'll upload these files to S3 bucket. Okay. Now, what we'll be essentially building is we'll be creating an EC2 instance first. Okay. the first step will be creating an EC2 instance in here for your actual web server on which we are going to host the website. Okay. Now, after this, I need to have a database as well. Now, we are all aware that RDS is a managed database service in AWS called as a relational database service, but you cannot directly connect to a database. That means a database is not a VM on its own. So rather, it does not give me full functionality to access the VM underlying. It's a managed service. So what I'll have to do is I'll have to create an EC2 which will allow me to connect to the DB. So this VM or this EC2 will allow me to connect to the DB in order to interact with it or perform certain operations on top of it or things like that. So we can have a EC2 for connecting to DB, performing certain operations in here. Then we'll have an actual RDS database. So we have a relational database on which your files for the database are going to be there in here. And we will be setting that up. Next, we also need the permissions to be configured. So essentially how services like EC2 will be able to access services like S3 bucket, we have to create an IAM role for that. Okay, set up an IAM role relevant for the same, and then we cover a little bit on S3 bucket setup, and we do that setup in here. So maybe initially what I'll do is I'll pick the easy things, the setup that is required for this. So I'll start with the S3 bucket. I'll start with the IAM role. I'll show you that. And then we'll proceed and then we'll set up the EC2 web server, the EC2 connection to database, and then the RDS in here. And once that is done, I will be able to set up the DB in here. We'll be able to access it. We'll also use the tool called as MySQL Workbench to be able to set up. So in order to interact with the RDS or database in here, you will obviously need some kind of a tool in here. So we will use this tool called as MySQL Workbench so that we can connect to the DB and then we can perform certain operations like adding files, creating tables and things like that. And then at the end, we'll be able to see the website working on the server. Is this making sense, folks? Yeah. Don't worry if you don't understand all of these terms. I will show you this. I will walk you through this. I'll explain that as well. But again, the focus is my focus right now is more on the project session that we are doing in here. So my focus is not to teach you these services just, it is to teach you and then help you to connect them and actually set up a simple application in here. Okay, so on this note, let's actually start with this. So first step, obviously, I hope you all have an AWS account and you have set that up as part of this training sessions in here. So you will be logging into an AWS account. So let me move over to the same. What is this? This is basically my AWS account that I've logged in here, and you can actually create a free tier AWS account so that you can start working with it. So a free tier AWS account, you know how to set this up. You can get a free tier account directly from the AWS website, and then you can start working with it. And free tier means there are free services available for free up to certain limits in here, which you can leverage. So whatever resources we will create in here, we'll also keep them onto the free tier itself in here so that there are no separate charges in here. Okay, so let's start with this. So first, what we are going to do is we will be downloading the necessary files in here. So to do that, again, there is a Git repo on which these files are hosted by the team. So I'll just copy this. And this link is there in the document as well. So if you just look it up, what is the topic or what is the context is, these are all the files for the application that we have in here. So if you go in here, you'll be able to see a bunch of files available in here. Blood bank, JPG, connection, PHP, header, index, info, insert. So all of these are whatever the files are there, which are basically relevant to run our application on the server in here. So PHP files for the same are there, correct? So in the documentation, we've even shared what is the understanding of each and every file in here. So you can just take a look at that. You don't need to by heart this code. So why? Because see, from a AWS perspective, here you have to deploy the server, right? So you don't have to actually go in and worry about each and every code and everything in here. Someone might give you a bundle of files. You just need to ensure that whatever these files are there, the important files are there, which you will be uploading in here, whichever are relevant in here, and you'll be setting it up on your system. So that's more from a responsibility from an AWS end that you have. Okay, now my files are now currently on Git. I know how to download them. I can simply download this zip file from here. So I can say I want to I can simply go in here and I can say download zip and I can save it to my system, which I have already done in here. So now what I'm going to do is I will be going to S3 bucket and uploading these files to an S3 bucket. Okay, so I'm on the S3 bucket. Let's click on create a bucket to create one. Again, I'll maximize my screen so that you can get a better look at this. So create a bucket. I have to give this bucket a name. So first of all, very, very important, observe the region for the bucket. So currently I'm creating it in North Virginia. Again, you might be aware about this, that you can create a bucket in any region. The better thing is wherever your project or application is there, it's recommended to put the bucket in the same region of that in here. That's the general recommendation in here, so that we have less latency or less charges as well when it comes to data transfer in there. So that is the thing. So right now I have to provide a bucket name. So let me say blood bank dash Pranav. Okay. So again, you know that for an S3 bucket, you need the name to be unique in here. So unique as in the name cannot be repeated across. It has to be globally unique in here. So I've just done that. Then we come to object ownership. So I'm just going to set up ACLs enabled in here, access control lists enabled. So that means that if we want, we can actually control access for each object individually as well, right? If needed in here. And who is object ownership? The bucket owner is preferred. So whoever is the bucket owner, he'll be able to add files in here. Okay, he'll be able to modify, he'll be able to do owner, he is the owner in here. Then next, we are going to set up a website using these files. So basically, we'll have to make the bucket public. So see, in the real world, when do you make a bucket public? Only when you have the content which you have to host on any server in there, right? And you don't want any exposure to the outside world in here. That's where you will typically make a bucket public in here. See, generally, if you have any personal data on the bucket, you should never make the bucket public in here. But right now, it's a simple server, or it's a simple server with some of our data in here, which we'll be hosting. So that is why I'm going to turn this off. Turn this setting off. Okay. Next, what are we going to do is we're going to just keep everything as it is. I don't need to touch anything else, and I'm going to click on create a bucket. It will take a minute for it to set up the bucket, and I should be able to see this. Blood bank Pranav. Right? So we have this blood bank Pranav available in here. Now what I can do is I can upload the zip file that I downloaded from this. So I can click on upload. I can click on add folder, and I can actually add the blood bank folder in there. So I have this blood bank folder available in here, and I can just select that and I can upload the blood bank folder over here. So this, it will say this will upload all files from blood bank. Yes, I want to do that in. Okay, so in terms of the folder structure, we have blood bank, and under that we have all of these files available. Click on upload. It'll take probably a couple of minutes for it to upload, and I should be able to see this in. Uploaded. So we have successfully uploaded the files in here. So first step that is done, that is we've set up the S3 bucket, and that has already been configured in here. So I'm going to click on close in here, and I can see all of the files coming up in here. Okay. Now, what about the IAM role? Now, the next thing that I need to do is I need to give the permissions. So before I create an EC2, I need to ensure that the EC2 or the VM is able to access the S3 bucket that I have in here. So I'm going to search for IAM and create a role. A role essentially gives the permissions required for the machine or required for the service to be able to talk to any other AWS service in here. So I'm going to go into roles, and we are going to create a role in. I'll tell you once again what is the use case. I have a EC2 instance in my account, which I'll be creating in the next step. Now that EC2 wants to connect to the S3 bucket to access the files that we have just uploaded. Now it cannot directly have that, right? So you need to have some permissions for that in here. So that permissions I'm going to do set that up with the IAM role in here. So coming to the question, should the IAM role be given within the same root user account? See, in this account, I can create multiple IAM roles. So I can create the IAM role by the root user also, by the admin user also. Currently, I'm logged in as an IAM admin user, and then I'm creating a role in the account. So best practice is always create or log in as an admin user and then create any further things that you. Does that make sense? If you still have a query, to let me know. Okay, who are the user here? Those are getting permissions. So here user is the VM or the EC2 that I'm going to create next in here. Okay, a quick question from Kamran. My user has already full privilege. Absolutely correct. My user already has full privilege. That is absolutely correct. But this role I am not giving to my user. This role I'm going to give to the EC2 instance or to the service that I'm going to create after this, which will be accessing the S3 bucket. So remember that services by default do not have any permissions. You need to give them permissions. Okay, so let's see this so that will make it a little bit more clear for you as well. So right now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to IAM and I'm going to click on create a role. So I went into roles, I clicked on create a role, and I clicked on AWS service in here. Now I need to select a use case. So I'll search for EC2. So I'll search for EC2 and I'll click on that. And it says allows EC2 instances to call services on your behalf. Now, which services I will have to provide that in here. So I can click on next. And here I will be adding the permissions in here. So I will be adding the relevant permissions in here for the instance to be able to access these things. Now, just for this particular demo, okay, what we will be doing is we will be adding permissions of administrator access. I can also give just S3 full access. That should also be fine for this. But just for this particular demo in here, we can give it admin access, or I can also give it S3 full access. So let's say we give it S3 full access. we'll do one thing. We'll not give it admin access. If required, we can obviously come back and then change the permissions. That will basically not confuse you anymore. So right now what we are doing is we want to give the EC2 access to S3 bucket. So we will give it the permission of Amazon S3 full access. Okay. Click on next. Okay. Now I need to give a name to this IAM role. So I'll call it as Blood Bank Project. Okay, once you do that, what you'll be able to see in this on the screen is something called as a trusted entity, or select trusted entity in here. Now this automatically pulls up in here, which shows EC2 in here, ec2.amazonaws.com. That means this, in this account, EC2 instance or EC2 service will be able to assume the role and have the permission of S3 full access in here. Okay. And then I'll click on create a role. Sorry. So that role already exists in my account probably. So let me do one thing. I'll say blood. Let's name it as blood bank project role to make it unique. And click on create a role. So I have this blood bank project role that I have just created in here, okay, which has Amazon S3 full access. And if you go to trust relationship, it shows that EC2 will be able to assume this role. Okay, now next what we will be doing is we'll be actually creating the EC2 for the web server and the database server in here. So let's go to EC2 and create a VM in. Okay, I'm going to click on launch an instance in here. That is going to launch a server for me. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is I have to add some tags to the server so that I can identify what the server does. So first we are going to start with creating a web server. So I'm going to say blood bank dash web server. Okay. Then application OS images in here. I'm going to select Amazon Linux in here. And it will be Amazon Linux 2023 AMI. So basically Amazon Linux is what? It's a flavor of CentOS operating system, right? It is called as Amazon Linux, and that is basically used to, we will be using it to create a VM. Yes, so I am going to assign this role to the EC2, which I'm going to create in. That is the understanding. That was one of the questions, I believe. So instance type, again, to keep it in the free tier, we will be selecting T2 micro only. So T2 micro is again, I think 1 GB RAM and 1/2 core CPU in here. So we are going to keep it basic in here for the free tier. Next up comes key pair. Key pair is basically used to log in to the machine in here. So we typically use a key pair to log into the machine in here. So I can say create a new key pair. And we can give a name to this key pair in here. I can call it as and since I already have one with the same name, it should not cause a conflict on my system. So I will say bloodbank1.pm in here. Okay. So this key pair basically we are using when we want to connect to the server. So if you want to SSH into the server in here, you can use a key pair for that. Currently, for our demo, though, we will not use any other third-party tool. We will do that directly via AWS only. But in case you want to use any tool like Putty or any other tool, OpenSSH, to connect to the VM, you can use this in here. So we'll create a key pair and we'll save it to our system in here. So I'll save it to my machine. Okay. Now, moving on, important settings. Network settings. I'm going to click on edit. We are going to keep this in the default network. Now, if you have created your own custom network, you can put this in that as well. That is not a problem. But already AWS by default gives me a default network in the account. I will use that. You can also use the same. How do you identify it's a default network? It usually has this IP range 172.31.00/16. So we've selected that. Then subnet, if you want, you can put that in a specific subnet as well. So I can say I want to put it in US East 1A in my account in here. Is it compulsory to put it in US East 1A? No, you can put it in any available, any subnet, but the subnet should be a public subnet. That means it should be able to have public connectivity. Now, for a default VPC or for a default network, anyway, by default, sorry if I said the default over a lot of times, but what I mean to say is essentially it always has this public connectivity. That means it has connection to the gateway from the network, and it will be able to create machine which can have an IP for that. Okay, so quick question, should the subnet be in the same region as the S3? So subnet scope is not at the or rather S3 scope is not for a availability zone. Whenever you create an S3 bucket that is in the region, we are anyway creating this EC2 in the region only. For the subnet though, we are going to create that in US East 1A, but it can be in any availability zone in the same region. So S3 by default does not have scope at the availability zone level. S3 bucket is created in a region. If I live in UK, but selecting the subnet in US, what about the latency? So again, remember that here you're developing an application. It is not about you as a application developer sitting in a specific region. So just for example, right now I am located in India. Okay. Sometimes I move to the UK, but that does not mean that whenever I'm using AWS, I need to choose the region which is closest to the developer. You choose the region based on your end users or for whom you're designing the application. So ideally, you should create an application closer to your user. So let's say my users are in US, then I'll create an application in the North Virginia. As a developer, I don't face any latency when I'm developing this. Okay, auto assign public IP, we'll enable it because I need an IP to be able to connect to the server. Then we are going to say create a security group in here. So what is a security group? It is basically like a firewall which will allow me to open the port on the server in here. So to be able to connect to the server, you need the ports to be open on it. So we will first give a name to this security group. We'll call it as Blood Bank 1 SG. Okay, and we need to add rules. Now there is already one rule which is there by default, SSH 22. Now one thing you need to be very careful about. In the real world, you should not open SSH to the entire world. Now this, since it's a demo, it's a project, it's fine. But in the real world, you will only mention a certain IP address or a certain range of IPs from which you need to be able to SSH into the server in here. That is the best practice. But right for this demo, it is fine if we open to the entire world anyway, because only I will be accessing it for the current demo. And then once our demo is done, once our project is done, we can delete that. So SSH is already there. We want to add a security group rule in here. That is for HTTP. Now, what is HTTP? It is basically a web server. So if you want to create a web server in here, you can do that with HTTP. Now, why not HTTPS? See, we all in our modern browsers, we use HTTPS. But if you want to use HTTPS, you need to add a additional SSL certificate. That means the green lock that you see on your browser in front of the website, that basically defines that there's an SSL certificate that has to be installed on the system. So in the real world, you can either get an SSL certificate from a provider, or you can set up an SSL certificate on your own on the machine and then turn it into a server, which we do for live integration. So when you want to make your application live on the world, then you set up HTTPS. Right now, for the demo, we will go with HTTP. SSL is basically what? It's just a very simple certificate that tells you that your server, whatever you're creating, is secure in here. So generally, whenever you go to any website, at the start, this is HTTPS. That means it's a secure certificate in here. Secure website. No tampering and anything happens on this website in here whenever you access with it. Okay, so HTTP we have specified in here. Now we're going to open this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this server into a website. For that, I need the HTTP port to be open on it. Okay, so I said 000/0. Moving on. So kept everything as it is. Next, whatever we've configured so far, the role, right? We need to specify the role in here as well. So initially what we've done, we've just created the role. But now I want this EC2 to be able to use that role in here. So I will search in here for the blood bank project role that I just created for you. So blood bank project role. Say keep everything as it is, not touching anything else. Do a quick review, very, very important. Whenever you're creating things, do a quick review of them. So software image, Amazon Linux 2023, T2 micro, new security group, and 1 volume 8 GB storage. That is fine. Click on launch instance. Okay, so when you launch the instance, it takes a couple of minutes for it to get started. So now I waited for a minute in here to just to check that the instance state has set to running in here. Now I'm going to connect to the server in here. So how to do that is simple. You click on the connect button in here. So this is a direct way of how I can connect to the VM or connect to the machine in here. So I will in here. And I'll say connect using a public IP and I'll click on connect in here. So basically what we are doing. Okay, quick question from Ray. If you didn't assign an IP, how do you go back and assign it to the EC2? Technically, you can't directly change that setting from there, Ray. But there is a setting called as elastic IP. So you have to create an elastic IP and then you can attach that to the EC2 in case you've forgotten to do that. Okay, moving on. I'm going to click on connect, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to create or set this up in here. So I'm going to first of all say sudo su to get the root permissions in here. And what we'll be doing is we'll be installing the web server on this in here. So I will install Apache, yum install httpd to install Apache in here. Click on enter. Okay, it says, is this okay? I'll say yes. And I'll install this. And I'll start the Apache service in here. So Apache is basically a web server that allows me to set up a web server on this Linux environment. So think about it. How do you create a web server on a virtual machine? right? So you need to have some kind of a setup for that. So HTTPD is basically a web server called as Apache, which I can set up on a Linux machine. So that is why I installed Apache. I said yum install HTTPD. Now I'm going to start the HTTPD service in here. There are two very famous servers on Linux. One is Apache HTTPD and other one is Nginx in here. So those are servers which basically allows you to turn your VM into a web server. You say service HTTPD start. Then service HTTPD status. Okay, so we have basically server is configured, which is listening currently on port 80. Now, if you remember, in the VM also, we have opened the port 80 on the security group so that we can access this. So now back to the EC2, I am in here and I can see the public IP of the server in here. Yes, Tanya. So if you want to install Apache, you need to install the package that is HTTPD. Okay. Now I can copy the public IP and I can try to access this. Now this is pretty much okay. This is expected. Why? Because this is by default our browsers go to HTTPS. So I'm going to change it to HTTP. I'm going to force it to go to HTTP. And it shows me a default page of it works. Okay, which means that, okay, this is working. This is fine. Later on, we are going to replace that with an actual functioning web server in here. So right now it is just doing this for me. Now back to the instance page. Now what I want to do is I want to install some more packages on it as well, because if you have seen the GitHub website, we have some PHP and everything over there. So we need that as well to be installed on the machine to make it work. So before installing any new packages, I will run a command to update the system for the same in here. If you write anything wrong, it will not work. So Linux, basically, if you write anything wrong, it will not work or it will throw an error. That is why we are doing a service HTTPD status just to check if we have been able to start the server in. So sudo dnf update is a command to update the system before we install any new packages in. Click enter. And it says if you get the warning, then upgrade to the latest version. So basically, if I get a warning on this, then I need to upgrade to latest version. I'm not getting any warning, so nothing to do after this. Everything is okay. Now I can straight away go in and I can install PHP and different packages. So for that, there is also something called as a DNF package manager. Now don't worry, these commands, whatever I'm putting, they are there in the document, which you can just follow along later on. Here, just observe what I'm doing it here. There is something called as a DNF package manager, in which it has some packages available under that. So PHP is basically the framework that we're going to use to create that web server, right? So I can install PHP by just running a command in here. So I'm going to do that right now. PHP, then MySQL, whatever is relevant required for the project, for the web server. I'm just going to install that with this one command in here. Sudo dnf install PHP, CLI, FPM, MySQL, and everything. And click on enter. That will install it for me. Okay, done. So now I can say PHP-v, right? Just to print the version of this in here. So I can verify the version of this in here. So as you can see, PHP is not installed by default, but it is available on the Linux system. Basically, it is available in the package manager, and then I can install it from the package manager in here. So right now, I have done the installation here of it from the package manager. So I can say php-v to print the version of this in here. So this is basically showing me the version of this, which is fine for our project in here. Now, I have installed PHP, but just like how you do it on your systems, when you install a new software, that software might not start running immediately. You have to restart your web server for that. So just like that, here I have to restart the Apache web server on my system in here, which I will do with a couple of commands in here. So I will basically tell it to again check if Apache is installed. It is already there. Dependencies is all, nothing to do. Then I will tell it to start the Apache service again. These are standard commands which I will normally run to interact with it. To start Apache, then enable the Apache service. So the command for that is sudo systemctl enable Apache. Okay, and finally call a restart in here. So again, if there are any errors in this, it will throw an error on the screen. Sudo systemctl restart Apache. Okay, done. So we've been able to do this. There are no errors in here. So the first step in our discussion, that is creating an EC2, that is done in here. Okay, so now what we'll be doing is we'll be creating a Ubuntu EC2 for a database. That means what? I will be creating again a database server, as I said, in the next step. But before I create the database, there should be a way that I can connect to the database and I can run some commands on it, right? So for that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a Ubuntu based EC2. Remember, on this EC2, the database is not going to be there. The EC2 is just going to be used to be able to connect to the database and have commands run through that. So what we will be doing is I'll again go to EC2 and create one more VM. Okay. And we'll click on launch instance to launch it. Okay. So now I have to put the name and tags in here. So I will put it as blood bank dash database. Okay. Now remember that when I say this blood bank dash database, remember that the database is not going to be hosted on this VM. This VM we are just creating in order to connect to the DB that we are going to set up in the next step. So again, you know how to create an EC2. We've gone through that. So I'm going to quickly go through that as well. But for this, I'm going to specify Ubuntu as the operating system. So I'm going to use Ubuntu as the operating system for this. Okay. Next, Ubuntu Server 24. And instance type will be again T2 micro only. Key pair, we have already created the key pair, if you remember, called as blood bank 1. I will be using that. And under the networking settings, I'm going to click on edit. Again, same like last time, what I'm going to do is I am going to say this is default subnet. If you want, you can put that in the same subnet for simplicity. So I'm going to say I'm going to put it in US East 1A, the same subnet. Okay. Enable. Then we are going to create a new security group in here. So we're going to create a new security group in here. Now what we're going to go and name it as blood bank db1 sg. So I'm going to name it as blood bank db1 dash sg in here. Okay, and for description, I'm going to copy paste the same thing in here. And type is going to be so I already have SSH in here. I'm just going to add, okay, I'm going to add a security group rule in here. We are going to use this to be able to connect to the DB, right? So for this, I will add one rule of MySQL. So basically, to connect to a database, you need to ensure that you've opened that port, relevant port in here. So I'm going to say MySQL Aurora in here. Okay, and 3306 is the port number range for the same in here. And source, again, I'm going to say anywhere for this particular example. Source is going to be anywhere. If one web server is launched, why do we create another web server? So Kamran, this is not a web server. This is a server which we are just going to use to connect to the DB. You will say, can't you do it on the web server itself? That is not a good practice. So you have separation where you use the web server just to host the application. Here we are using another server, right, to be able to connect to the DB. Why are we creating two security group rules? Because the first rule is to be able to connect to this VM or virtual machine. And the second rule is going to be able to use to connect to the database in here. So we are going to use this to connect to the database over 3306 port, right? That is why we are opening the rule in here. Don't worry, as you move through, you'll get clarity on that, what I'm exactly going to do with this. Okay, so done. This much is done. Now I'm going to scroll down to move to advanced details. Just take a look at settings. I don't need to change anything for now. Keep everything as it is. Okay, and then I'm going to say launch on the instance. Launch instance. And it will again take a couple of minutes for it to be ready in here. If you go to the instance, it will be in the initializing state. Okay, now it is in the running state. So I waited for a minute casually in here to see it to the running state in here. So now what we will be doing is we will be clicking on connect in here and connecting to this Ubuntu server as well. What's the difference? Here you can see in terms of the username, there is Ubuntu in here. Earlier it was EC2-user because it was Amazon Linux server. That's the only difference. You don't need to change anything and you can click on just connect in here. Okay, so we have connected to the Ubuntu based server in here. So now what is it that we will be doing on this, or why are we using this server? We want to work with MySQL, or that is one of the type of databases in here. We will be using this server in one of the further steps to install database or to set up the database, to interact with the database, to run commands on the database in here. But to do that, you need the MySQL utility to be installed on this machine in here. Okay, so I cannot directly use this machine to interact with the database in there, which is why I need to install those libraries or those things in here. So how am I going to do that is I will be again updating the packages just like I did HTTPD in the previous way. Or right now I'm going to do things for MySQL here in this example. So I will go to paste this to update and upgrade the packages on the server. And you can see since it's Ubuntu, a little bit syntax is different. We say sudo apt upgrade or apt update. The apt package is used to update this in here. Okay, it will take a minute for it to maybe update. So basically it is updating the packages so that we can next go in and install the package that we want in. Okay, how you close the session properly when you're using Connect? Okay, the right way to close the session properly is ideally you click on the terminate button, or so either you close on the terminate button if you see that. If it is not there, you can just close the session. That's not going to be a problem. It is not going to interrupt any services that are running over here. So you can simply go in there. Sorry, just a second. Ignore this. Once you have connected to the SSH Connect and you don't want to use it in here, you can simply click on this cross button on the browser to close it. That is not going to cause a problem on the machine because we are just connected to the machine as such, and we have just run the commands. Once our work is done, you can close that browser window. And next time when you want it, you can go in and you can again click on connect in. Okay, coming back to my database EC2 in here, I'm going to run a command to install MySQL server. So it's also a standard command in here. Sudo apt install MySQL server in. Say enter, Y and enter. There is one additional command that I need to run after this is to improve security of the MySQL installation, and I'll run a command for that. I'll just wait for this to finish, and then I'll run the next one. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say sudo MySQL secure installation. That will basically just improve the security of the MySQL installation. And basically what it does, it asks for a couple of things in here. It will ask you that do you want to go ahead and have security in here. So validate password can be used to test passwords, improve security. Would you like to set up this validate password component? I will say yes. Okay, then there are 3 levels of password validation policy. For me, for this particular example, low is fine. Then it says remove anonymous users. I can say N. Disallow root login remotely. I can say N. Then remove test database and access to it. I can again say N. Reload privilege tables. Now I can say N. So basically, if you want to do some security-based settings on the DB, you can do it like this. Currently, we're not going to do anything complex in here. We just want to have a password when we connect to the database in one of the further steps. That's all. Okay, now what we need to do is by default, MySQL on Ubuntu binds to the local host, right? It can only be accessed locally in here. But what I'm going to do next is I will be using a software or a kind of a software to be able to connect to the database that I'm going to create. And I will be using this VM to run the commands or to basically execute the commands in here. To do that, to have that kind of functionality to allow remote access, I will have to modify this MySQL configuration. In very, very simple words, remember that MySQL can only be accessed locally through this Ubuntu, but I want another software which runs on my machine to use this Ubuntu to add commands to my database. To do that, I will have to just modify the MySQL configuration file. I will show you what that is as well in a minute here. So I will run this command. to see the MySQL database configuration file. Just a second. Out of it and run this again probably. So Nano is nothing but the name of the editor, which basically allows you to create a file, and you will be able to modify the file as well. So we just want to use the Nano editor to modify this MySQL configuration. And I'm going to find a setting here that says bind address. Okay, there is a setting in here that says bind address. Okay, I'm going to, so this is now corrected to 127.0.0.0. That means local host. That means the same machine. I'm going to change this to 0.0.0.0. That means anywhere, basically. Sorry, 4 zeros. Change this to anywhere. Similarly, I'm going to say MySQL bind address. That also I'm going to change to same thing, 0.0.0.0. Okay. Now, once I do this change, I'm going to save the file. To save the file, you run a command Control X. Just a second. Control X, Y, and enter. Okay. Now, what I want to check is I want to check the version of my SQL running on this. So I just want to do a check on that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say my SQL and version command. So what command I'm going to run is MySQL version, and it says MySQL version 8.0.43. That is fine. Okay, next up, this is done. Now again, if I want to close the session, I can do that. I can click on this button to close this session. No problem with that. Okay, the next step, what we need to do is we need to configure our actual database in here. So let me go back to AWS and let me search for RDS in here. That is a database that I'm going to set up. Okay, so now I'm going to go to DB database instances in RDS, and I'm going to create a database in here. So obviously preferred is the same region. So wherever you have created the EC2, try to put that database in the same region so you have low latency when you're setting this up or when systems access this thing in here. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a database. I'm going to say create a database, and let's say standard create, and the engine type is going to be MySQL. Okay, edition MySQL community is fine. And version that I'm going to go with is, you can select any version. Latest version is generally preferred. For this demo, we will go with 8.0.41. See, the only difference what happens in versions, some of the features, some of the things might change here and there. So recommendation is, whenever you're doing projects, if you have at a project level, you've identified a version that you want to go with, stick with the same one in here. And later on, you can do testing, and then if you can upgrade to a different version later on if required. So right now for this, we will go with 8.0.41. Okay, choose database creation method. We will say free tier template. So free tier template is what? Because we don't want to incur any heavy costs for this. So single AZ database instance deployment, it will be in one availability zone only. That is fine. Moving on, I need to give a name to the instance, DB instance identifier. So I will call it as blood bank DB. Okay, we call it as blood bank DB. That's basically a name for the database server that I'm creating. Master username, let it be admin. Okay. And for password, I'm going to put a strong password in here. So I will be putting a strong password in here. Okay, so I've selected the master username as admin. That comes by default. And password, I've set up a strong password in here. And when you're doing this, make sure that you note down the username and password, because we're going to use this in one of the further steps in here. Okay, then for the instance configuration, we are going to keep it simple. So dbt4g micro is enough for this. So db.t4g.micro in here. And storage general purpose SSD in here, allocated storage is 5 GB in here. Okay, so we are going to go with 5 GB as the allocated storage for this, because that is more than enough for this particular example. Then connectivity, we will say, we'll come to this. We don't need to say don't connect. So don't connect to an EC2 compute resource for now. We'll later on do that in one of the further steps. Okay. Then IP4 network type is fine. The default one. Default VPC is also fine. Remember that once you create the database, you cannot change the VPC of it. Okay. DB subnet group. Subnet group is basically a set of subnets, right, in which you can create the DB in here. So why is this a subnet group setting available? Because in databases, there is a high availability concept. So if you select that high availability or public multi-AZ option, in the future, if it wants to create a standby database, there should be a backup subnet which is available in here. So a subnet group at least needs 2 subnets to be there in here. So currently, the default subnet group already has 6 AZs, 6 subnets. So no problem with this. And for public access, we are just going to do yes. So yes for public access. Okay. Then security group, right? So just a second. So I'm going to say new VPC security group, and I'm going to name it as blood bank DBSG. So blood bank database security group I'm going to create in here. Yes, for now, do not connect to EC2. That is fine, because later on we're going to add that, Satish. So in the next step, we will be adding that once the database is created. Don't worry. So availability zone, you can tell it to be there in one of the availability zone preference. So I can say US East 1A in here, new VPC security group name in here. And in terms of additional configuration, I just need the port to be open. So since we have MySQL, so 3306 is the database port that we will use. Then I'll come down to additional configuration, additional settings. So I have to provide a database name, initial database name in here. So I will say blood bank underscore DB in here. And DB parameter group. Anyway, I'm going to keep everything as it is. I don't want backup. So I'm going to remove this. Right. And I'll remove enable encryption as well. So just so that it does not cause a problem in my account, I have turned it off. Then I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to say create a database in here. So I can just review the settings once. For DB, shouldn't we keep under private subnet and restrict public access? True. In the real world, that will be true. You will put your database in a private subnet. For this particular demo, we have to keep it basic for now. That is why we are just putting it in the public subnet in here. So we have just said VPC, default VPC, DB subnet group. create new blood bank DBSG US East 1A 3306 and click on create a database. Okay. It says suggested add-ons. I don't need them. I'm going to close this. I'll give at least takes about a couple of minutes for this to set up. Okay. So now what we'll be doing, our database is ready. We want to connect to the database, right? And we need to run a bunch of commands on the same as well, right? But for doing this, we will be using a software, as I told you earlier, called as MySQL Workbench. Now, installation steps are given on the document. You can simply search for MySQL Workbench and you can install that on your system. I have already installed that on my machine and it is ready. I'll just open it up and I'll tell you how to create a connection. But before I do that, there are a couple of settings that I need to configure, which I will do here quickly in here. So before I jump into that part, identifier over here, there is also something called as an endpoint and port in here. So endpoint, let me copy the endpoint in here and let me open a notepad where I can save this. So basically what I've done is I've opened up a notepad and I've saved the endpoint in here. Okay. The next thing what I need to do is I need to look at the security group that was there. So when we created the RDS, along with that, we created a security group for the same in here. So let's take a look at it. If you go in here, there is a default rule available that says SQL, but the source for that is set to the same machine's IP range in here. So for that, what we will be doing, we will be just adding a new inbound rule. We'll keep this rule as it is. Let's not modify it. Let's say MySQL again. Here, I'll just say anywhere IP4. That means we want anyone just for this particular demo, we want to be able to connect to the database over the MySQL port, right? And that is why we are opening this port on the machine. I'm going to click on save rules in here. Right? See, because the database, the port has to be open on the database, right? Otherwise, how we'll connect to it? Now, one of the questions that Satish asked is we need to connect this RDS to the EC2 also that we created a few minutes back, correct? The database one. So how to do that is you go to actions, you say setup, okay, my bad. You go to actions on the database, not here in the security. So if I go to RDS, and I go to DB instances and I select the database instance, I go to actions, I can say setup EC2 connection in here. And I can choose the EC2 that we created in here. So the first one, blood bank database in here, and I can click on continue. So what it is happening, I'm just setting up a connection between RDS and EC2 in here. So it says to set up a connection, this will be added to the database and this is added to the instance. It will be set up in here and we'll click on setup here. Okay, done. Now, if you have created this in a different availability zone, if the instance and database, it will just throw a warning in here that if it's in a different AZ, then cross-region, cross-AZ charges will apply in here. So that's also a thing that might add to the cost. It's not, I'll not say it's not the right thing to do, but ideally preferred is to keep both of them in the same AZ. That's what we've done in this part. So now we have the EC2 set up with RDS in here. Now, the next part is we need to be able to run commands to set up things on the database. See, database is currently empty. Nothing is on there. So we'll be using a software which is called as MySQL Workbench. So there are many different softwares available. Allows you to interact with the databases, run commands on it. We'll be using one of them called as MySQL Workbench. Okay. So mine is already set up. What I'm going to do next is I will be connecting to a database and running the queries to create a table inside the database. So for that, let me click on database, connect to database. Okay. Now I have to be careful. What I want is I want to connect to my database standard TCP IP over SSH. In very simple words, what I want to do is I will be using this right software, but I will be using the database Ubuntu server that we created. Yeah. And through that, we will run the commands on the RDS or on the database in here. So we have to put a endpoint URL in here. So I have to put the endpoint URL from this RDS in here. So first of all, connection name I can provide. So standard TCP IP over SSH. And I need to provide the SSH host name in here. So this SSH host name will be nothing but the IP of the database server in here. So from where I'm going to get it, I can go back to instance details for the blood bank database. I'm going to copy the public IP on it, and I'm going to again paste it in my notepad. So on my notepad to paste this. Okay, I'm going to paste this. I'm also going to verify once so that I don't have any confusion. The endpoint, it is of this. Let me quickly check that. Yeah, it is the same thing. That is correct. Okay, let's go back to the MySQL Workbench. So SSH hostname, I'm going to put in the IP in here. Public IP of the blood bank database. Okay. See, remember that RDS database, whatever you created, you cannot directly interact with it. Right? You need some kind of a software, something to be able to install and set it up in here. That is why. So RDS database, I directly cannot log into it as a VM in here. So I need some kind of a layer in the middle, which is why we will be, or we have used the EC2, the database server to do that. I could have done it on the web server itself since it was already a Linux type of a thing, but that was not the best practice. So I created a separate database server, and then I have used that to interact with the RDS team. You can't log on into an RDS that you created and pay for. It's not like that, Ray. I cannot log in because it's a managed service. It's a managed service. So I directly cannot log in into the underlying VM, which is why I need some kind of a software or some kind of a tool to interact with. Okay. So here for the SSH username, we will be providing Ubuntu as the username. Okay. SSH password, I'm not going to provide a password because I already have a key file, SSH key file that is there called as bloodbank1.pem, which I'm going to use. So bloodbank1.pem is the name of the key pair. My SQL host name is what? The host name that we copied of the database. So if I again open my notepad, I can copy this section on and paste it in here. My SQL host name, my SQL server port 3306. Here username is going to be admin. And if you remember, we had put a password for the database. So I'm going to say add password. And I'm going to click on OK in here. Now we will test this connection if it is working correctly. So we can say and it says could not connect to SSH, could not connect the SSH tunnel, which is expected because we do not have a fingerprint key, right? So I can say OK. And I'm opening the SQL editor for the connection. Kamran, yes, the password is the database password that we configured. Yes, that is the database password that we've configured. Okay, once that is there, I get into the SQL editor and now I can start running commands in here to be able to add data to the database in here. So here, whatever commands that I'm going to add, those are used to interact with the database in here. Okay, first thing first, foremost, I need to see whether there are already any databases available in here or not. So I will run a command show databases. And let me run this. Show databases. So we have this blood bank underscore DB. How did it appear in here? If you remember, when we created the RDS, we specified the DB instance initial database name. That was this blood bank DB that we specified. That is why there is a database like that on the machine. Okay, now I want to use that. So to use that, I will run a command use blood bank underscore DB. And I'll execute this. Okay, done. So normally, let's say that in the team there is a developer or there is a database person. He will basically configure the database for you. He will run these commands in here to install or set up the tables for you in here. And you maybe from an AWS end, you will just connect to the database and you will test whether everything is there or not, right? And then you can do the integration. So I'll just run a couple of commands in here to create tables in here because my database is empty. So I will just run some commands in here. Like I'll create a table called as register in here, which will have some of the fields and I'll execute them. Okay, done. First table was created. Then I create one more table for the logins. Create table login is done. Now I can see the tables that were created based on this. So show tables. And I can see that there are two tables, login and register, that we created. Now, okay, now this is done. The next step, what we need to do is we need to basically set up a website on EC2, which will be able to interact with the database in here. So now what we need to do is typically when it comes to S3 stores static assets like images, CSS files, JavaScript, these kind of things in here. EC2's main role is to process dynamic content like handling requests, interacting with the database and all of those kind of things. So in the next step, what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy the code that I have from S3 to EC2 for deploying my website and application logic in here. So I'm going to go back to my web server on EC2. Let me go to the web server that I created first. And I'll connect to it. Blood bank web server. Let me connect to it. So what I'm going to do is I am going to just click on connect in here. Okay. So now, first of all, let's become the super user in Linux to be able to run the command. So we can say sudo su for the same. Now, see, I have to copy the files from S3 to EC2. When you talk about Apache, Apache uses a specific path called as /var/www/html. So it is /var/www/html. It basically looks for any of the main files or whatever your web server files are at this location by default. So we will first move into that directory. For that, there is a simple command called as cd/var/www/html. Okay. Now, after this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy the files from my S3 bucket to this EC2. So again, for that, there is a simple command. I just need to replace the details with my bucket that I have in here. So what I'll do is I'll open my notepad again. Okay. And here I'm going to paste the command. So it is basically AWS S3 copy command, which will copy data from my bucket and paste it over here. So what we will be doing, let's go to S3 and copy the name of our bucket, the bucket and folder name. Okay, blood bank Pranav. Under that, I have something like blood bank in here. So what is the path ideally? Let's copy in. Blood bank dash Pranav, and in the path, what I'm going to put is I'm going to say blood bank in here. Okay, so whatever files are there in here, I want them to be copied over to this. As I earlier said as well, you don't need to by heart the SQL commands, all of the commands. Though it's good to have knowledge a little bit about a database and some basic commands, it's not compulsory when you are learning AWS in here. You just need to know how that essentially works, how we connect the database to the EC2, what is it that we will be doing. As such, for this project, you don't need to by heart those codes, that is not required. Okay. So now on this, back to the machine. And if I run this, okay, it has downloaded the files over here. And if I do an ls, it's to list the files in here. Okay. And now I want to do what? I want to copy the public IP of the server. So I go back to the instance details and I see my instance in here. Blood bank web server. Public IP address I can see in here. I'll open this up. And it basically does what? It nothing but populates the files that we have over here. So whatever you see on the instance, these are the files that we have, red blood, JPG and everything. So by default, what it does, it looks up this index.php. So basically what happens is that at this location, that is /var/www/html, whatever is the default index.php file or index.html file, It will look that up and it will open that. And then it will basically, it already has this hierarchy, the PHP, on what all files are listed under that. And that is how you can access a website in here. So this is how you go in, how you access everything. The only thing which is not set up here is our database yet. So we have just set up the website as of now. So for example, if you go to, these things are working. The simple pages are working in here. But if you go to donor register, right? And if I go in here, it will throw an error that the for RDS endpoint is failed, name or service not known, because we have not yet configured that in here. So how do I do that is I have to update the file with the correct database credentials, database setup in here. So what I'll do is I already am connected to this VM, as you can see, right? Let's modify the file so that we add the relevant details in here. So I'm going to say sudo nano connection.php and click on enter. My bad. Okay. So what it says is it basically tells me that, okay, whatever details are there, you have to provide them in here. So you have to provide the database host name, the username, the password that you set up, the database name, and all of these details in here. So let's go ahead and let's do that in here. So what I'm going to do is I am going to copy paste these details. I already have them on my notepad. So this is my host name that I copied. So let's go in here and replace this first of all. Okay, so I have this that is set up. Next, username was admin only. Password was, let me put in the password in here. Any secure password basically that you have set up for the database that you will be putting in here. Your DB name, that is blood bank DB. Okay, so what I'm going to do next is I'm going to, once I've set up all of these details, I'm going to save it using Control X, Y, and enter. Okay, now I need to cross check the changes that I've done in this connection file. So to do that in Linux, you can just run a simple cat command in. So cat command is basically used to check these details. It opens the contents of the files and shows that to you in here. So that is what I have done in here. Now let's go back to the IP address and see if anything changed on that. So if you've put the credentials correctly, it should now work on the server for me. Okay, so folks, I have shown you this till this part. Now the last part is basically connecting to the database and then filling the form and adding data to the database. So that is the part that you will have to give it a try. Following the same steps in here, whatever we have done so far. So that will be a stretch exercise for you based on this. If you get stuck, you relay that back to us and we will help you out with the same. In case you get stuck or you're not able to figure that out, you can relay that back to us. I'll show you the document.
So that's it for today's project. We have just built a dynamic blood bank management system on AWS, covering everything from EC2 to RDS and IAM. And if you are ready to level up your AWS career, don't miss our free AWS Cloud Masterclass. Register through the link in the description and pinned comments, and learn the proven strategy that's helped professionals land their dream jobs. And also, if you found this video helpful, Do like, comment and subscribe for more hands-on tutorials. Thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next one.